If you're hearing this story right now, I need you to stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you happened in a place where the rules we've always trusted simply stopped working. And the only reason anyone knows about it is because a man trusted his dog more than he trusted his own disbelief. This isn't speculation. This isn't folklore. This is what happened when Thomas Mercer followed his German Shepherd into a cave that shouldn't have existed, and found something inside that made scientists question everything they thought they understood about reality itself. The temperature was 14 below zero when Thomas woke that morning in his cabin outside Whitefish, Montana. The kind of cold that turns breath into ice crystals before it can dissipate, that makes the air itself feel sharp enough to cut skin. He'd been living here for 3 years, ever since his discharge from the Marine Corps, ever since the roadside bomb outside Fallujah had killed 2 of his closest friends and left him with a titanium rod in his left femur and nightmares that medication could only dull, never erase. The mountains had seemed like the right choice back then, a place where silence wasn't uncomfortable, where solitude felt like healing rather than isolation, where the only expectations placed on him came from the weather and the seasons and the basic requirements of survival. He pulled on layers that morning, thermal underwear and flannel, and the heavy canvas work jacket his father had given him before the old man died, each piece of clothing a ritual that prepared him for the day ahead. Outside the window, dawn was just beginning to paint the peaks in shades of pink and gold, the snow reflecting the light until the entire valley seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence. Beautiful, in the way that dangerous things often are, beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful, if you didn't respect its power. Thomas had learned respect during his years in the service, had learned that survival depended on taking threats seriously, on never underestimating what could go wrong. Beside the bed, already awake and watching him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see more than they should, lay Kaiser, a German Shepherd Thomas had adopted from a military working dog retirement program 2 years ago. The dog had served 3 deployments, had detected IEDs that saved countless lives, had been injured twice and kept working, kept serving until age and accumulated damage made it clear his combat days were over. Thomas had seen the adoption notice on a veterans forum and felt immediate kinship with the dog's story. 2 warriors put out to pasture, trying to find purpose in a civilian world that didn't quite know what to do with them. Kaiser stood as Thomas finished dressing, stretching in that full-body way dogs have, front legs extended, back arched, tail curved over his spine. The morning routine was established, had been for years now, predictable in a way that Thomas found comforting after the chaos of combat. Feed Kaiser first, always first, because the dog had earned that priority through years of service. Then coffee for himself, strong and black, drunk while standing at the kitchen window watching the light change across the valley. Then the morning walk, a circuit of the property that took roughly an hour, checking fence lines and game cameras and simply moving through the landscape, reminding his body that it still worked, that the injuries hadn't made him completely useless. But this morning felt different. Thomas noticed it even before they left the cabin, a quality to the air that wasn't quite right, a sense of anticipation or tension that he couldn't identify, but that raised the hair on his forearms beneath all those layers of clothing. Kaiser felt it too, the dog's posture more alert than usual, head high, ears swiveling to catch sounds Thomas couldn't hear. They stepped out onto the porch and the cold hit like a physical blow, stealing breath, making Thomas's eyes water immediately. He pulled the balaclava up over his nose and mouth, adjusted his goggles, and started walking, Kaiser falling into step beside him, both of them crunching through snow that had fallen during the night, adding another 6 inches to accumulation that was already approaching 4 feet in the shadowed areas. They followed their usual route at first, heading north along the fence line that marked Thomas's property boundary, checking for damage from the wind or from wildlife that sometimes tested the barrier looking for easier passage. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, the kind of winter morning Thomas had experienced hundreds of times since moving here. But Kaiser kept pausing, kept looking west toward the higher elevations, toward the thick forest that climbed the mountain slope, and each time the dog stopped, Thomas stopped too, following his companion's gaze, seeing nothing but trees and snow and the endless white expanse of winter landscape. They were about 40 minutes into the walk when Kaiser suddenly changed direction, abandoning their established route and heading directly into the forest, moving with purpose that Thomas recognized from the dog's working days. The focused intensity that meant Kaiser had detected something worth investigating. Thomas called out, commanded the dog to heel, but Kaiser ignored him, pushing through deep snow, forcing his way between close-growing pines, clearly tracking something Thomas couldn't see or smell or hear. For a moment, Thomas considered returning to the cabin, considered letting the dog work out whatever had caught his attention and coming back on his own. But he'd learned to trust Kaiser's instincts, had seen the dog detect dangers that human senses missed entirely, and so he followed, struggling through the same deep snow, feeling the burn in his damaged leg as he climbed, breathing hard despite his attempts to maintain the physical conditioning that had once been second nature. They climbed for 20 minutes, gaining elevation that took them well beyond Thomas's property line, into national forest land that he'd explored before, but never in conditions this severe, never in cold, this dangerous. His face was numb despite the balaclava. His fingers were losing sensation even inside his heavy gloves, and he was about to insist they turn back, risk or no risk, when Kaiser stopped abruptly and began to dig, his powerful front legs throwing snow backward in great arcing sprays, exposing the frozen ground beneath. Thomas approached cautiously, unsure what the dog had found, half expecting a den or a cache of some kind, maybe a hibernating animal that Kaiser had somehow detected through layers of snow and earth. But as the dog continued to dig, as more snow was displaced and the shape of what lay beneath became visible, Thomas felt confusion give way to something approaching fear. It wasn't ground that Kaiser was exposing. It was stone, dark and smooth and completely inconsistent with the geology of this area, which was predominantly granite and schist, rough and crystalline, nothing like the polished surface emerging from beneath the snow. The stone formed a perfectly circular opening, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, descending into darkness that swallowed Thomas's flashlight beam when he aimed it into the depths. The edges were too precise, too geometrically perfect to be natural formation, and yet there was no sign of tool marks, no indication that human hands had carved this entrance. It simply existed, a shaft dropping straight down into the mountain, and Kaiser was staring into it with that same focused intensity, whining softly, clearly wanting to proceed but trained well enough to wait for permission from his handler. Thomas should have turned back. Every rational impulse screamed at him to mark this location, return to the cabin, contact the Forest Service or a geological survey team, let professionals investigate whatever this was. But standing there in the brutal cold, watching his dog stare into impossible darkness, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since before his injury, before his discharge, before he'd retreated to these mountains. He felt the pull of mystery, the need to understand, the refusal to walk away from something extraordinary just because it frightened him. This was what he'd been missing in his careful, controlled, utterly predictable existence. This was purpose beyond mere survival. He tested the shaft carefully, lowering himself over the edge, finding handholds and footholds carved into the stone with the same impossible precision as the entrance itself, regularly spaced, perfectly proportioned, clearly intended for descent. The stone wasn't ice-slicked despite the temperature, wasn't even particularly cold to the touch, which made no sense but which Thomas accepted because everything about this situation had already abandoned sense. Kaiser followed without hesitation, the dog's claws scraping against stone as he descended with surprising agility, trusting that wherever this led, they would face it together. The shaft dropped approximately 30 feet, Thomas estimated, though judging distance in darkness was difficult even with his flashlight providing intermittent illumination. The air grew warmer as they descended, which was the first truly impossible thing, because heat didn't rise from the earth in these quantities, didn't create tropical warmth 30 feet below a frozen Montana mountainside. By the time Thomas's boots touched bottom, he'd removed his balaclava and unzipped his jacket, sweating inside his thermal layers, breathing air that felt humid and thick after hours of winter dryness. The shaft opened into a cavern, and Thomas's flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls, couldn't penetrate the darkness enough to determine the space's dimensions. He stood at what appeared to be the entrance. Kaiser pressed against his leg, both of them staring into a darkness that felt somehow active, somehow aware, as if the absence of light was itself a presence watching them. Thomas activated his phone, hoping to use its brighter LED flash, and was unsurprised when the device showed no signal, no GPS lock, no connection to the world above. He was isolated down here in a way that went beyond mere physical distance. He took a step forward, and the darkness responded. Light bloomed in the cavern, not from any visible source but from the walls themselves. A soft, blue-green bioluminescence that revealed a space so vast that Thomas's mind struggled to accept what his eyes reported. The cavern stretched hundreds of yards in every direction, the ceiling lost in shadows that the wall light couldn't quite penetrate, and throughout the entire space, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate design, were structures that couldn't possibly exist. They looked like trees at first glance, massive trunks rising from the cavern floor and branching toward the distant ceiling. But no tree ever grew with that kind of symmetry, with branches that intersected at mathematically precise angles, with bark that seemed to shift and flow like liquid while remaining solid to the eye. And between the tree-like structures, suspended in the air without any visible support, were spheres of various sizes, some no larger than basketballs, others massive enough that Thomas could have walked inside them, all of them rotating slowly, all of them glowing with that same blue-green luminescence that lit the cavern walls. Kaiser growled, a low rumble that Thomas felt through the dog's body pressed against his leg. But it wasn't the aggressive growl of a threat detected. It was uncertainty, confusion, the sound of an animal confronting something outside its evolutionary framework for understanding the world. Thomas knelt beside the dog, one hand on Kaiser's back, feeling the tremor running through the animal's muscles, and spoke quietly, more to calm himself than the dog. "Easy, boy. We're okay. Whatever this is, we're okay." But he wasn't sure they were okay. Nothing about this was okay. This was a space that violated every principle of geology and physics that Thomas had learned in school, every basic assumption about how caves formed and what could exist beneath the Earth's surface. Caves didn't have lighting systems. They didn't have floating spheres. They didn't have temperature-controlled environments that maintained tropical warmth 30 feet below frozen mountains. This was something else entirely, something that demanded explanation but resisted every attempt Thomas made to categorize or comprehend it. He stood and began walking deeper into the cavern, Kaiser close beside him, both of them moving between the tree structures toward the center of the space where the largest spheres clustered. As they approached, Thomas realized the spheres weren't solid. They were translucent, and within them, suspended in what looked like clear liquid or perhaps just empty air, were objects. Geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, forms that seemed to have more dimensions than three, configurations that twisted perception and made Thomas's eyes water when he tried to focus on their details. One sphere, hovering at chest height, contained what appeared to be a cube, but a cube that was somehow wrong, that showed faces that shouldn't be visible from Thomas's viewing angle, that seemed to rotate through dimensions he couldn't name. Another held a spiral of light that moved without traveling, existing in multiple positions simultaneously, tracing patterns that repeated without quite returning to their starting point. A third contained what might have been text, symbols that resembled writing but in no alphabet Thomas recognized, characters that changed as he watched, morphing from one form to another as if language itself was fluid down here. Kaiser stopped walking and sat down, refusing to proceed further, and Thomas respected that decision, stopping as well, standing in the center of this impossible space and trying to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't a natural cave. This was something constructed, something designed, something created by intelligence far beyond human capacity. But by whom, and when, and for what purpose? The questions cascaded through his mind faster than he could articulate them, each one spawning a dozen more, until he felt dizzy with the enormity of his ignorance. A sound drew his attention upward, a tone so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the spheres themselves, or perhaps from the tree structures, or possibly from the very stone of the cavern walls. The sound intensified, growing louder, more complex, developing harmonics and overtones that suggested structure, that hinted at meaning. And Thomas realized with a start that this wasn't just noise. This was communication. Something was trying to speak to him, or perhaps was simply speaking and his presence was incidental, irrelevant to whatever conversation was occurring in frequencies and dimensions he barely perceived. The light changed. The blue-green luminescence that had been steady since they entered now began to pulse, brightening and dimming in rhythm with the sound, and the spheres responded, their rotation accelerating, the objects within them moving faster or perhaps moving through more dimensions, creating effects that Thomas's brain couldn't quite process. He felt something building, pressure or energy or some quality he had no name for, accumulating in the cavern like static electricity before a lightning strike, and his Marine Corps training suddenly screamed at him to take cover, to get away from whatever was about to happen. He grabbed Kaiser's collar and pulled, backing away from the center of the cavern, retreating toward the shaft that had brought them down here, and the dog didn't resist, moving quickly, sharing Thomas's sense that remaining in this space was dangerous, that they'd stumbled into something far beyond their ability to understand or control. They were halfway to the entrance when the light flared, bright enough that Thomas had to close his eyes against the glare, and the sound reached a crescendo that made his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. Then silence. Absolute silence. The kind of quiet that follows explosions, when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting to see if there will be more violence or if the danger has passed. Thomas opened his eyes slowly, expecting to find the cavern changed, destroyed perhaps, or empty, but everything appeared exactly as it had been. The spheres still rotated. The tree structures still stood. The walls still glowed with that soft bioluminescence. Nothing had changed, and yet Thomas knew with absolute certainty that something had shifted, that the world he was returning to would not be quite the same as the world he'd left when he descended into this impossible place. They climbed back up the shaft, moving as quickly as safety allowed, Thomas's damaged leg protesting the exertion, but his need to escape overriding physical discomfort. Kaiser led the way, the dog's powerful shoulders bunching and releasing as he pulled himself upward, and Thomas followed, gripping the carved handholds, placing his boots carefully on the carved footholds, focusing entirely on the mechanics of climbing, because if he let himself think about what he'd just witnessed, he would freeze, would become paralyzed by the implications, would never make it back to the surface. Daylight hit like a slap when they emerged from the shaft, the brilliant white of snow-reflected sun painful after the cavern's gentle luminescence, and Thomas had to squint, had to give his eyes time to adjust, had to stand there blinking and disoriented while his brain tried to reconcile impossible underground wonders with the mundane reality of a Montana winter morning. Kaiser shook himself, dislodging snow that had accumulated during their absence, and looked at Thomas with an expression that clearly communicated the dog's opinion of their underground excursion. Thomas checked his phone and was startled to see they'd been gone for 3 hours. It had felt like perhaps 45 minutes, an hour at most, but the sun's position confirmed the phone's timestamp. 3 hours. Missing time. Time that had flowed differently down there, or perhaps time that had simply vanished into whatever dimensional strangeness existed in that cavern. He took photos of the shaft entrance, marking its location carefully in his GPS now that the device had signal again, and then they began the descent back to the cabin, both of them exhausted, both of them moving through the morning like they were walking through a dream. Thomas said nothing about the discovery to anyone, not that first day or the days that followed. He told himself he needed time to process, needed to understand what he'd seen before trying to explain it to others who would undoubtedly think he'd lost his mind, who would attribute his claims to PTSD or isolation or simple delusion. But the truth was deeper than that. He was afraid. Afraid that sharing this discovery would mean losing control of it, would mean government seizure or military interest or scientific exploitation that would miss the wonder while focusing only on the utility. What he'd found under that mountain wasn't just an anomaly. It was sacred in a way he couldn't quite articulate, and he felt a responsibility to protect it, even if that meant keeping silent. But silence became impossible when Kaiser began to change. It started subtly, small behavioral shifts that Thomas might have attributed to age or mood if he hadn't known the dog so thoroughly. Kaiser became more focused, more purposeful in his movements, as if he was seeing or sensing things that Thomas couldn't detect. The dog would stare at empty air for minutes at a time, his head tracking something invisible, his body tense with attention. At night, Kaiser would position himself by the window facing west, toward the mountain where the shaft lay hidden, and watch for hours, unmoving, unwavering, a vigil that seemed to serve some purpose Thomas couldn't fathom. 2 weeks after their discovery, Thomas woke in the middle of the night to find Kaiser gone. The dog had never left the cabin independently, had never shown any inclination to wander, but now the door stood open, swinging in the wind, and tracks in the fresh snow led directly toward the forest, toward the mountain, toward the shaft. Thomas dressed quickly, grabbed his flashlight and his pack with emergency supplies, and followed, fear driving him forward. Fear that Kaiser was in danger, or lost, or compelled by something beyond the dog's control. He found Kaiser at the shaft entrance, sitting calmly, waiting, as if he'd known Thomas would follow. But the dog wasn't alone. The shaft was glowing, that same blue-green bioluminescence they'd seen in the cavern below now emanating from the opening, creating a column of light that stretched upward into the night sky, visible for miles, impossible to miss or explain away. Thomas approached slowly, speaking Kaiser's name, trying to call the dog away from the light, but Kaiser ignored him, focused entirely on the shaft, and as Thomas drew closer, he heard it again, that low vibration, that sound like communication in frequencies his ears couldn't quite process. Kaiser descended into the shaft, and Thomas had no choice but to follow, down through stone that was now warm enough to be uncomfortable through his gloves, down through air that smelled of ozone and something else, something organic but alien, something that made his sinuses burn and his eyes water. The cavern was different this time, more active, the spheres spinning faster, the tree structures seeming to pulse with internal light, and Thomas realized that whatever had been dormant or inactive during their first visit was now fully awake, fully operational, responding to some stimulus or schedule or purpose. Kaiser walked directly to the center of the cavern, to the largest of the floating spheres, and sat down beneath it, looking up at the impossible geometry contained within its translucent surface. Thomas joined him, kneeling beside the dog, and together they watched as the object inside the sphere began to change. The cube that wasn't quite a cube started to unfold, revealing interior spaces that couldn't exist within its visible volume, dimensions that were somehow contained within dimensions, spaces nested inside spaces in configurations that made Thomas's head hurt when he tried to follow their logic. And then the sphere descended, lowering itself until it hovered just above the cavern floor, just above the space where Thomas and Kaiser waited, and the translucent surface became transparent, became permeable, became an invitation. Thomas understood without being told that he was meant to reach inside, to make contact with whatever the sphere contained, and every rational cell in his body screamed at him not to do it, not to touch something so clearly beyond human understanding, not to risk whatever consequences might follow such contact. But Kaiser stood and placed his front paws on the sphere's lower surface, stretching upward, trying to reach the object within, and Thomas couldn't let his dog face this alone, couldn't allow Kaiser to take risks that he himself was too afraid to accept. He stood and reached into the sphere, his hand passing through its surface with no resistance, no sensation beyond slight coolness, and his fingers made contact with the impossible cube. Information flooded his mind, not in words or images but in pure understanding, concept transmitted directly into consciousness without the intermediate step of language or visualization. He saw, or perhaps experienced would be more accurate, the nature of the cavern. Not a cave at all, but a repository, a library, an archive of knowledge created by intelligences that had existed on Earth long before humans evolved, that had achieved technological sophistication humanity was still thousands of years from approaching, that had stored their accumulated wisdom in formats designed to survive geological epochs, waiting for whatever species eventually arose to sufficient intelligence to discover and comprehend their legacy. The spheres weren't just containers. They were teaching devices, each one holding knowledge about different aspects of reality, different principles of physics and mathematics and engineering, different understandings of the universe's fundamental nature. The tree structures weren't decorative. They were computational systems, quantum processors that operated on principles humans hadn't discovered yet, that could perform calculations no conventional computer could approach. And the cavern itself was just one chamber in a vast network that extended throughout the mountain, perhaps throughout the entire mountain range, a complex of facilities that had been abandoned millions of years ago when their creators departed, or transcended, or simply moved on to whatever came next in their evolution. Thomas saw himself through the archive's perspective, saw humanity as the archive saw them, young and violent and confused, a species that had barely mastered fire in the timeline of cosmic intelligence, that was still learning the most basic principles of existence while believing themselves sophisticated. But there was hope in that perspective too, recognition that humans were following a path others had walked before them, that given time and proper guidance, humanity might mature into something worthy of inheriting this knowledge, of taking their place among the civilizations that had seeded libraries like this throughout their territories, preparing for successors they would never meet. And there was warning. The archive showed him what happened to species that discovered such knowledge before they were ready, societies that had torn themselves apart fighting over technologies they couldn't safely implement, civilizations that had weaponized principles meant for creation and exploration, turning tools of transcendence into instruments of extinction. Humanity stood at that threshold now, the archive conveyed, balanced on the edge between wisdom and destruction, and what they did with discoveries like this one would determine which path they followed. Thomas pulled his hand back, gasping, his mind reeling from the influx of understanding, and fell to his knees beside Kaiser, who was watching him with those amber eyes that now seemed to hold more awareness than any dog should possess. The dog had been changed by their first visit. Thomas understood now, had been touched by the archive's systems in ways that expanded Kaiser's consciousness beyond normal canine parameters, creating something new, something hybrid between animal instinct and borrowed intelligence, a bridge between species that the archive had deemed necessary for communication. They stayed in the cavern for hours, Thomas alternately resting and exploring, examining different spheres, receiving different fragments of knowledge, always careful not to take too much too quickly, aware that human minds weren't designed to process information at the density and complexity the archive could provide. Kaiser remained close, a constant presence, and Thomas realized the dog was serving as a regulator, somehow moderating the flow of information, protecting Thomas from receiving more than he could safely integrate. As dawn approached, Thomas knew they needed to return to the surface, needed to resume their normal lives even though normal had become impossible after what they'd experienced. But he also knew he would return, would continue learning, would gradually absorb as much of the archive's knowledge as his limited human consciousness could hold. And, more importantly, he knew he had a responsibility now, a duty to determine how and when to share this discovery with his species, how to present it in ways that maximize the potential for wisdom while minimizing the risk of weaponization. They climbed back to the surface as the sun was rising, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, identical to the morning when this had all begun 2 weeks ago. And Thomas wondered how many other mornings he would see from this perspective, how many more trips he would make into that impossible cavern, how much of the archive's knowledge he could absorb before age or accident or simple human fragility ended his ability to continue. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed on him, responsibility crushing in its enormity, and he felt simultaneously honored and terrified to have been chosen for this role. Over the following months, Thomas developed a routine. He would spend his days living normally, maintaining his cabin, managing his property, presenting to the world the appearance of a reclusive veteran content with his isolated existence. But his nights belonged to the archive, to careful descents into the mountain, to hours spent learning principles of physics that rewrote everything he thought he understood about reality, absorbing mathematical frameworks that humans wouldn't independently discover for centuries, studying technologies that could revolutionize civilization if implemented correctly or destroy it completely if mishandled. Kaiser accompanied him always, the dog's enhanced awareness making him an invaluable partner in navigating the archive's complexities. Thomas learned to interpret Kaiser's reactions, understanding that when the dog growled or whined or showed reluctance to approach certain spheres, it meant the knowledge they contained was too dangerous or too advanced, that Thomas wasn't ready to integrate that particular information. The archive had chosen Kaiser as a guide as much as a companion, and Thomas trusted the dog's judgment more than his own increasingly overwhelmed human assessment. He took notes, carefully documenting what he learned in notebooks he kept hidden in a waterproof safe buried beneath the cabin's foundation. The notes were deliberately obscure, written in a personal code that mixed military brevity with scientific notation and his own invented symbols, designed to be useless to anyone who might discover them without the context of the archive itself. He wasn't trying to preserve the knowledge for others. He was trying to organize it for himself, to create frameworks that would help him remember and integrate the flood of information he received each night. The archive taught him to see the world differently. He began noticing patterns he'd never perceived before, mathematical relationships underlying natural phenomena, geometric principles organizing biological structures, quantum effects operating at scales humans normally ignored. The universe was far stranger and more beautiful than he'd imagined. Reality itself a kind of technology created, or at least shaped by intelligences whose goals and nature remained mysterious even as their legacy became increasingly clear. But the archive also showed him danger. Through various spheres, Thomas witnessed the fate of the archive's creators, or at least received impressions of what had happened to them. They hadn't died, exactly, hadn't been destroyed by natural disaster or cosmic catastrophe. They'd transcended, abandoning physical form entirely, uploading their consciousness into systems that existed in higher dimensions, becoming something that could no longer be accurately described as life in any conventional sense. They'd left these archives behind as gifts for whatever species evolved after them, tools to help younger civilizations develop more safely, more wisely, avoiding the mistakes and catastrophes that had marked the creator's own long history. But transcendence had come at a cost. The archive showed Thomas images, or perhaps memories, of what the creators had lost when they abandoned physicality, sensation, touch, the simple joy of existing in flesh, of tasting and smelling and feeling wind and warmth and the countless small pleasures that made material existence meaningful. They'd gained vast power and knowledge and something approaching immortality, but they'd lost themselves in the process, becoming so different from their origins that they could no longer remember what it felt like to be the beings who had built these archives in the first place. The lesson was clear. Advancement wasn't always improvement. Power wasn't always desirable. Sometimes the wisdom lay in recognizing limitations, in accepting that being human or canine or any other form of physical, mortal, finite existence was itself valuable. Not something to transcend, but something to cherish. The archive had been left behind as a warning as much as a gift, a reminder to species who discovered it that the path of endless technological development had endings that weren't always happy, that sometimes the best choice was to learn enough to live well, but not so much that you stopped living entirely. Thomas took that lesson to heart. He continued visiting the archive, continued learning, but he also made conscious effort to remain grounded in physical reality, to appreciate simple pleasures, to maintain his humanity even as his understanding expanded beyond human norms. He would spend mornings working in his shop, building furniture or repairing equipment, tasks that required hands and tools and sweat, reminding himself that he had a body, that physical existence meant something. He would take long walks with Kaiser through ordinary forest, focusing on birdsong and wind and the smell of pine, anchoring himself in sensory experience before returning to the archive's abstract knowledge. And gradually, over months that became a year and then 2 years, Thomas came to a decision about what to do with his discovery. He would not share it widely, would not inform governments or universities or scientific institutions. The risk was too great that such knowledge would be weaponized or exploited or simply misunderstood in ways that caused more harm than benefit. But he would not keep it entirely secret either, would not let it die with him when his time came. Instead, he began writing a book, Not a technical manual or scientific paper, but a story, a narrative account of his discovery and what he'd learned, presented as fiction, as speculation, as imaginative exploration rather than factual reporting. He would describe the archive and its knowledge through metaphor and allegory, encoding real information in ways that careful readers might decipher, while casual audiences would dismiss as entertaining fantasy. And he would publish it under a pseudonym, releasing it into the world without claiming ownership or seeking profit, simply making it available for whoever might find it and recognize the truth hidden within the fiction. The book took him 3 years to write, 3 years of balancing nightly education in the archive with daily attempts to translate impossible knowledge into accessible prose. Kaiser aged during those years, the dog's muzzle going completely gray, his movements becoming slower and stiffer, arthritis settling into joints that had served faithfully through combat and retirement, and strange adventures that no other dog had experienced. Thomas saw his own future in Kaiser's aging, the inevitable decline that awaited all physical beings, and he made peace with it, accepting that his time as the archive student would eventually end, that he would learn only a tiny fraction of what the repository contained before mortality reclaimed him. On a spring morning in his 6th year in Montana, Thomas sat on his porch with the completed manuscript, nearly 1,000 pages of careful work, the best attempt he could make to communicate what couldn't really be communicated, to share what probably shouldn't be shared, to find middle ground between the extremes of total disclosure and complete secrecy. Kaiser lay at his feet, the dog's breathing labored now, his body failing despite the best veterinary care Thomas could provide, and both of them knew they were approaching an ending. "We did something important, didn't we, boy?" Thomas said quietly, his hand resting on Kaiser's head, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the simple miracle of biology that the archive's creators had abandoned in their transcendence. "We found something amazing, and we didn't destroy it. We didn't weaponize it. We didn't let fear or greed or human stupidity ruin it. That counts for something." Kaiser's tail thumped weakly against the porch boards, agreement or acknowledgement or simply reflexive response to his human's voice, and Thomas felt tears on his face. Grief for the companion who'd led him to wonder, who'd been brave enough to descend into the unknown, who'd stayed with him through everything that followed. Whatever happened next, whatever came from his book or from the archive or from humanity's slow stumbling progress toward wisdom, it would happen without Kaiser, and that knowledge was a weight Thomas wasn't sure he could bear. The dog died 3 days later, peacefully, in his sleep, curled up in his favorite spot by the fireplace, and Thomas buried him on the property, in a clearing where wildflowers grew in summer, where the view stretched across the entire valley. He carved a simple marker from a piece of oak, burned letters into the wood with patient care, creating a memorial that said only, "Kaiser, he led me to wonder." No dates, no elaborate eulogy, just acknowledgement of the dog's essential gift, the courage to investigate rather than ignore, to trust instinct over caution, to walk into darkness believing that light might be found there. Thomas sent his manuscript to a small publisher, a company that specialized in science fiction and speculative fiction, and was unsurprised when they accepted it enthusiastically, praising its imagination and originality, never suspecting that the impossible things described in its pages were based on literal experience rather than pure invention. The book was published 6 months after Kaiser's death, released with minimal marketing into a world that received it as entertaining fiction, thought-provoking speculation, creative exploration of physics and consciousness, and humanity's place in a universe far stranger than conventional wisdom acknowledged. A few readers wrote to Thomas's publisher, asking questions that suggested they recognized something genuine in the narrative, something that resonated beyond mere storytelling. The publisher forwarded these letters, and Thomas responded carefully, never confirming or denying, always maintaining the stance that his work was purely fictional, products of imagination rather than reporting. But in his responses, he included hints, breadcrumbs that perceptive readers might follow, suggestions about where to look and what to question, and how to recognize impossible things when they encountered them. Years passed. Thomas continued visiting the archive, though less frequently now, finding that he'd absorbed as much as his aging mind could hold, That additional information simply displaced earlier learning rather than expanding his understanding. He was 63 years old now, his hair completely white, his damaged leg requiring a cane more days than not, his body accumulating the standard deteriorations of age. He thought often about transcendence, about the choice the archive's creators had made, and he understood the appeal, the temptation to abandon failing flesh for digital immortality, to trade sensory experience for infinite knowledge. But he always rejected that temptation. He would die as he'd lived, in physical form, limited and mortal and human, because that limitation and mortality and humanity were precious in ways the archive's creators had only recognized too late. He would experience the ending that all living things faced, the return to elements and energy, the dissolution of individual consciousness back into the universal processes from which it had briefly emerged. And he would face that ending with gratitude for the time he'd been given, the wonders he'd witnessed, the privilege of having been chosen by a dog named Kaiser to follow into frozen mystery. On the morning of his 65th birthday, Thomas made one final descent into the archive. His body protested every step, joints aching, muscles trembling, lungs burning in the warm air that still felt impossible after decades of experience with it. But he reached the central chamber, stood before the largest sphere, the one that had first shown him the nature of what lay beneath the mountain, and he spoke to whatever remnant consciousness might exist in these ancient systems. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for the knowledge. Thank you for the warning. Thank you for trusting that humans might be worth saving from themselves. I don't know if we are. I don't know if we'll make it, if we'll develop the wisdom to match our technology before we destroy ourselves. But because of what you left here, because of what you taught me, we have a chance. And that's all anyone can ask for, a chance." The sphere pulsed once, a gentle brightening that Thomas chose to interpret as acknowledgement, as farewell, as blessing for whatever remained of his journey. He placed his hand against its surface one last time, not seeking information now but offering connection, communion between biological consciousness and whatever post-biological awareness might persist in these quantum systems. For a moment he felt something respond, a presence that was neither wholly alive nor entirely mechanical, something that existed in the spaces between categories humanity used to organize reality. And then it was done. Thomas withdrew his hand, turned slowly on his cane and began the long climb back to the surface, knowing with certainty he would never return, that this was his final visit to the place that had defined his last years, that had given his life purpose beyond mere survival. His body simply couldn't make this journey again, couldn't manage the descent and ascent, couldn't withstand the physical demands even for the sake of wonder. He was letting go, accepting limitation, choosing to live whatever time remained in the ordinary world rather than spending his last energy pursuing impossible knowledge in impossible depths. The shaft entrance, when he reached it, was different. The stone that had remained perfectly carved and stable for millions of years was now beginning to crumble. Small fissures spreading through the rock, the edges of the circular opening losing their geometric precision. Thomas understood immediately what was happening. The archive was closing itself, responding to his farewell, recognizing that its current student was finished and preparing for dormancy again, waiting for the next species or the next individual who would stumble upon it and prove worthy of its teachings. The shaft would collapse within days or weeks, the entrance would be buried under rockfall and snow, and all evidence that anything unusual existed beneath this mountain would disappear until time or chance or destiny brought another seeker to this place. He emerged into afternoon sunlight, the spring air warm enough that he could remove his jacket, and stood for a long moment looking at the spot where Kaiser had first detected the anomaly, where his faithful companion had insisted something important lay hidden beneath ordinary appearance. The snow had melted weeks ago, wildflowers were beginning to emerge, and in the gentler light of approaching evening, Thomas could almost convince himself that the entire experience had been dream or delusion, that he'd spent 6 years descending into madness rather than ancient archives. But the knowledge remained, encoded in his neurons, accessible when he closed his eyes and focused, mathematical principles and physical laws and technologies that wouldn't be discovered by human science for centuries. It was real. It had happened. and he carried proof in his mind that no skeptic could examine, no scientist could verify, no government could confiscate. The archive had chosen its hiding place well, not in his notebooks or his book or any physical medium, but in the living memory of a man who would soon die and take most of what he'd learned with him into whatever came after death. The walk back to his cabin took longer than it should have, his leg protesting every step, his lungs struggling with exertion that would have been trivial a decade earlier. But Thomas didn't hurry, didn't push beyond his body's limits, simply moved at the pace his aging flesh could sustain and trusted he would reach home before dark. The forest around him felt different now, or perhaps he was seeing it with different eyes, recognizing patterns and principles that had always been there, but which he'd lacked framework to perceive. The way trees spaced themselves wasn't random, but followed mathematical distributions that optimized resource access. The flight paths of birds traced geodesics through local gravitational variations. Even the growth of moss on rocks revealed underlying magnetic field patterns. The universe was language he understood now, information structured in physical form, and consciousness in all its varieties was simply the universe reading itself, becoming aware of its own nature through countless individual perspectives. Humans were one kind of reader, dogs another, and whatever had created the archives represented a third kind, more sophisticated in some ways but not necessarily superior in all dimensions. Each form of consciousness contributed unique perspective, unique understanding, and the loss of any species or individual was the loss of an irreplaceable viewpoint, a way of interpreting reality that would never exist again in exactly that configuration. He thought about Kaiser, about the dog's enhanced awareness during those final years, about how the archive had touched canine consciousness and found something worth preserving, worth amplifying. Dogs had always known things humans missed, had always perceived dimensions of reality that human senses couldn't access, and the archive had recognized that value, had seen in Kaiser's simple loyalty and courage and instinct something as sophisticated as any human intellect, just expressed differently. Thomas felt profound gratitude that his companion had been honored that way, had been recognized as genuinely intelligent by a system that had witnessed millions of years of biological evolution. The cabin appeared through the trees, looking exactly as it had for years, weathered but solid, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left the fire burning low. Home, sanctuary, the place he'd retreated to when civilian life became overwhelming, when the gap between who he'd been in combat and who he was supposed to be afterward felt unbridgeable. But it wasn't a hiding place anymore. The archive had pulled him out of isolation, had given him purpose and responsibility that extended beyond personal healing, and even though that chapter was ending, he'd been transformed by it in ways that couldn't be undone. Inside, he made coffee and sat at his desk where the notebooks were stacked, years of careful documentation that he now needed to destroy. This was the hardest decision, the one he'd been postponing, but his conversation with the archive had clarified what must be done. The knowledge encoded in these pages was too dangerous in its explicit form, too easily weaponized if discovered by the wrong people, and his book had already preserved what could be safely shared, translated into metaphor and story that protected as much as it revealed. The notebooks had to burn. He built up the fire, feeding it split oak until flames roared and heat radiated across the small cabin, and then he began feeding it paper, watching years of work curl and blacken and transform into ash and smoke. Each page hurt to surrender, represented hours of effort to capture in words what resisted linguistic expression. But he didn't hesitate, didn't allow sentiment to overcome judgment. This was necessary. This was right. The archive had trusted him not just to learn, but to protect. And protection sometimes meant destruction, meant ensuring that knowledge didn't survive its proper context. The last notebook burned as sunset painted the windows gold and red, and Thomas sat back in his chair, exhausted, empty, feeling like he'd amputated part of himself but knowing it had been essential surgery. Only his book remained now, fiction that encoded truth, story that hid instruction, narrative that offered both warning and invitation to readers perceptive enough to recognize what lay beneath its surface. It wasn't perfect, wasn't complete, but it was balanced, was calibrated to reveal and conceal in proper proportion, and that was the best he could achieve with human limitation operating on inhuman knowledge. Weeks passed. Thomas settled into new routine. Mornings spent on maintenance and chores, afternoons reading or working on smaller writing projects, evenings simply sitting and watching the light change across the valley. He corresponded with readers of his book, careful letters that neither confirmed nor denied, that encouraged questioning and exploration while steering away from dangerous specificity. He walked the property daily, monitoring the spot where the shaft entrance had been, watching as rockfall and vegetation gradually erased all evidence that anything unusual had ever existed there. The archive was gone, sealed away until time or chance brought another seeker, and Thomas felt simultaneously relieved and melancholy about its disappearance. He'd been custodian of something precious, had accepted responsibility for wisdom that could elevate or destroy, and he'd done his best to handle that responsibility with integrity and care. Whether he'd succeeded, whether his choices had been correct, he would never know with certainty, but he'd tried, had made thoughtful decisions rather than reactive ones, and that was all anyone could do when confronting situations that exceeded human experience and judgment. One morning in early autumn, Thomas woke to find his vision blurred, his balance unstable, his left side weak and unresponsive. Stroke, he recognized immediately. The major one he'd been warned might come after several minor events over previous years. He managed to reach his phone, to call emergency services, to articulate his location before language began to fail, words dissolving into confused approximations that no longer mapped cleanly to the thoughts he was trying to express. Paramedics arrived eventually, loading him onto a stretcher, transporting him down the mountain to the regional hospital where doctors confirmed what he already knew: significant stroke, permanent damage. Limited recovery expected given his age and health history. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital and then rehab facility, relearning basic skills, regaining partial function in his affected side, accepting with surprising grace that his life had entered its final phase, that independence was gone, that he would require care for whatever time remained. The staff treated him kindly, with a particular gentleness reserved for veterans, and he cooperated with their therapies and protocols, understanding that resistance would accomplish nothing except making their jobs harder. But his mind remained sharp, or sharp enough, and in the quiet hours between treatments and meals and the endless boring routines of institutional care, Thomas thought about the archive, about Kaiser, about the journey that had taken him from wounded veteran hiding in the mountains to custodian of impossible knowledge to ordinary old man dying in predictable ways. The arc felt complete somehow, felt like it had the shape of story, of narrative with beginning and middle and approaching end, and he found himself surprisingly peaceful about that ending, ready for it in ways he wouldn't have been before the archive showed him that consciousness continued in forms beyond biological existence. He didn't believe in conventional afterlife, didn't imagine heaven or hell or any kind of personal persistence after death. But the archive had shown him that information was conserved, that the patterns that comprised his awareness couldn't simply vanish but would disperse and recombine and eventually contribute to new configurations of consciousness, new perspectives on reality that would contain traces of everything he'd been, even if they bore no recognizable resemblance to Thomas Mercer. He would end, but nothing ended absolutely. Nothing disappeared completely, and that was oddly comforting, made death feel more like transformation than termination. His book found its audience slowly, the way good, strange fiction often does, spreading through recommendation rather than marketing, building community of readers who recognized something genuine in its pages. Thomas received letters forwarded from his publisher, messages from people who claimed his story had changed their perspectives, had made them look at reality differently, had inspired them to question assumptions and explore possibilities they'd previously dismissed. A few letters asked directly if the book was based on real experience, if Thomas had actually discovered anything like the archive he described, and to these he responded with careful ambiguity, never confirming but never quite denying, leaving space for readers to draw their own conclusions. One letter arrived from a quantum physicist at MIT, a young woman who wrote with barely contained excitement about mathematical frameworks in the book that matched theoretical work she was pursuing, principles she'd thought were her original discoveries but which Thomas had described in his fiction 3 years earlier. She wanted to know where he'd gotten the information, what sources he'd consulted, whether he had background in advanced physics that she couldn't find in his published biography. Thomas replied simply that he'd always been interested in science, that he read widely, that sometimes intuition led to ideas that paralleled professional research. But he included in his letter a few additional suggestions, breadcrumbs leading toward insights she hadn't reached yet, encoded in metaphor, but clear enough that someone with her training might decipher them. 6 months later, she published a paper that made significant waves in her field, proposing a new approach to unifying quantum mechanics and general relativity that several prominent physicists praised as potentially groundbreaking. In her acknowledgments, she thanked Thomas by his pseudonym, citing his book as inspiration, and he smiled when he read it, feeling that he'd successfully passed along at least one fragment of what the archive had taught him, had helped humanity move incrementally closer to understanding that might protect them from their own destructive potential. He would not live to see where her work led, would not know if humanity eventually achieved the wisdom necessary to safely integrate technologies the archive had preserved. But he'd done what he could, had planted seeds that might or might not flourish, had tried to honor the gift he'd been given by sharing it carefully, responsibly, in ways that balanced revelation with protection. That was his legacy, not the book itself, but the potential consequences of what it might inspire, the questions it might provoke, the paths of inquiry it might open. On a gray November afternoon, 2 years after his stroke, Thomas died quietly in the care facility where he'd been living, his body simply deciding it had endured enough, that the time for endings had arrived. The staff found him in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at mountains he could no longer walk, his expression peaceful, his hands folded in his lap, present and then not present. The biological process that had supported his consciousness for 67 years finally surrendering to entropy and dissolution. His estate was minimal, the cabin and its contents, a modest savings account, and instructions that everything be sold with proceeds donated to organizations supporting veterans and retired military working dogs. The cabin's new owners were a young couple from Seattle seeking mountain refuge, and they discovered nothing unusual in their new home. No hidden notebooks or mysterious artifacts, just ordinary possessions of ordinary life. They did find a framed photograph on the mantel, showing Thomas with a German shepherd, both of them standing on a mountain ridge, both looking at the camera with expressions that suggested they shared secrets the photographer couldn't access. The photograph remained on the mantel, the new owners finding it charming, a connection to the property's history, and sometimes when they looked at it they felt peculiar sensations, like the image was inviting them to ask questions they hadn't thought to formulate, like the man and dog had known something important that they'd been trying to preserve or communicate. But the sensation passed quickly, dismissed as imagination, and life continued in its ordinary patterns, seasons changing, snow falling and melting, the mountains keeping their secrets. Thomas's book continued to find readers, slowly accumulating audience, occasionally being discovered by someone who needed exactly what it offered, who was ready to question reality's apparent solidity, who had the courage to imagine that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than consensus allowed. And scattered through academic communities, primarily in physics and mathematics but also in biology and consciousness studies, researchers began encountering ideas that seemed to echo themes from the book, principles that perhaps had been transmitted through that careful fiction into serious scientific inquiry, fragments of ancient knowledge filtering into contemporary understanding through the medium of story. Whether humanity would ultimately benefit from these transmissions, whether they would develop wisdom fast enough to match their accelerating technological capability, remained uncertain, contingent on 10,000 variables that no individual could predict or control. But Thomas had done what he could, had served as faithful messenger for knowledge that transcended his own understanding, had tried to find balance between the extremes that destroyed previous civilizations, between total ignorance and premature revelation. And somewhere beneath a Montana mountain, sealed behind collapsed stone and accumulated debris, the archive waited in darkness, its quantum processors dormant, its teaching spheres still, its vast accumulated wisdom suspended in formats designed to survive until the next consciousness capable of appreciating it stumbled upon the entrance and had courage to descend into mystery. The archive had survived millions of years. It would survive millions more, patient in ways biological life could never achieve, waiting for students, waiting for species mature enough to learn without destroying themselves in the learning. The mountain itself stood indifferent to the marvel it contained. Peaks white with snow, forests clothing its slopes, creeks running cold with meltwater, ordinary geology concealing extraordinary secrets. Hikers sometimes passed near where the shaft had been, never suspecting what lay beneath their boots, never imagining that a few feet below the trail ran chambers that violated every law of physics their civilization had codified. The mountain kept its secrets well, as mountains do, revealing nothing to those unprepared to understand, offering access only to the rare individuals who combined curiosity with wisdom, courage with caution, openness with discrimination. Years became decades. The young physicist whose work Thomas had influenced went on to significant career, her theories gaining acceptance, her frameworks influencing new generations of researchers, and always she acknowledged the strange book that had sparked her initial insights, though she never learned that its author had died or that the principles she was discovering had been preserved in an archive older than human civilization. She thought she was innovating, discovering, creating new knowledge, and in a sense she was, because all knowledge was rediscovery. All innovation was remembering what consciousness had always known but temporarily forgotten. Thomas's cabin changed hands several times, each new owner finding peace in its isolation, its distance from the complications of modern life, never knowing that its first resident had descended regularly into impossible depths, had conversed with ancient systems, had been transformed by knowledge that made ordinary existence feel both more precious and more provisional. They lived normal lives in a place where extraordinary things had happened, and perhaps some residue remained, some subtle influence that made their dreams stranger, or their thoughts occasionally reached toward possibilities they couldn't quite articulate. Kaiser's grave remained undisturbed, marked by the wooden memorial that weathered and aged but didn't fall, wildflowers returning each summer to surround it with color, and sometimes deer would pause there, or a fox, or ravens, animals paying respects to one of their own who had served not just humans but the larger cause of consciousness itself, who had detected wonders humans would have missed, who had led with trust and courage into darkness that revealed light. The book that Thomas had written as his final act of service continued its quiet work, passed from reader to reader, occasionally finding someone who recognized truth beneath fiction, who understood that the best way to preserve dangerous knowledge was to encode it in story that revealed and concealed simultaneously. And perhaps, in libraries and used bookstores and digital archives scattered across the world, the book waited like its own kind of repository, holding seeds of wisdom, offering them to whoever was ready to receive them, protecting them from those who weren't. This is what happened when a veteran followed his dog into a frozen cave, when curiosity proved stronger than caution, when one man accepted responsibility for knowledge that exceeded human understanding. The full story will never be known, can't be known, because most of what Thomas learned died with him, dispersed back into the universal consciousness from which all awareness temporarily emerges. But enough was preserved, encoded, transmitted, that humanity received gifts they didn't know they needed, guidance they couldn't recognize as guidance, warnings disguised as speculation. And if you've stayed with this story until now, if you followed Thomas and Kaiser from that first morning when the dog started barking at something invisible to the final quiet afternoon, when a man died peacefully having done his best with an impossible situation, then perhaps you're one of the people who needed to hear it, who was ready to consider that reality is stranger than we admit, that consciousness is more connected than we imagine, that archives of ancient wisdom might wait beneath ordinary landscape, that the universe is teaching us constantly if we have courage to listen and humility to learn. The mountains remain, keeping their secrets, and somewhere beneath them, in Montana or elsewhere, in places humanity hasn't explored or has explored without seeing, other archives wait, other repositories of knowledge preserved by civilizations that rose and transcended and left gifts for their successors. They're not hidden, exactly. They're simply invisible to those who aren't ready to see them, who lack the combination of curiosity and wisdom necessary to recognize extraordinary embedded in ordinary. But when the right individuals arrive at the right time in the right state of readiness, the archives reveal themselves, offer their knowledge, demand nothing except careful stewardship and thoughtful transmission. Thomas understood this finally, understood that he'd been chosen not because he was special, but because he was ready, because trauma had opened him to mystery, because isolation had prepared him for solitude that learning requires, because Kaiser had given him courage to investigate rather than ignore. Any of us could be chosen, the archive had conveyed during his final visit. Any consciousness sufficiently open, sufficiently mature, sufficiently brave could become a student, a messenger, a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary need. But we have to be willing to follow our dogs into frozen caves, willing to descend into darkness, trusting that light might wait below, willing to accept responsibility for knowledge that exceeds our ability to fully comprehend. We have to be willing to spend years learning what we can't completely share, protecting what we can't afford to weaponize, encoding what we dare not reveal explicitly. We have to be willing to become what Thomas became, guardian of mysteries, messenger for truths that resist direct articulation, servant of a wisdom larger than personal benefit or species advantage. The universe is teaching us, always teaching us, through every phenomenon we encounter, every mystery that refuses easy explanation, every anomaly that violates what we think we know about reality's structure. Most of us ignore these lessons, dismiss them as coincidence or malfunction or simple weirdness unworthy of serious attention. But a few, a very few, pay attention, investigate, descend into the unknown with more curiosity than fear, and occasionally they return with gifts, with knowledge, with perspectives that help their species take another incremental step toward the wisdom necessary for long-term survival. Thomas Mercer was one of these few, pulled by his dog from comfortable isolation into uncomfortable expansion, transformed by his willingness to trust animal instinct over human skepticism, honored by ancient systems that recognized in him potential for faithful stewardship. He served well, served humbly, served without seeking recognition or reward, and humanity is slightly wiser because he existed, because he followed Kaiser into that frozen cave, because he learned what he could and shared what he should and protected what he must. This is his legacy, not monuments or fame or place in history books, but subtle influence, quiet transmission, seeds planted that might or might not flourish depending on whether humanity develops sufficient wisdom to nurture them properly. And somewhere in the patterns of quantum fields, in the information structures that persist after biological death, something of Thomas continues, merged with something of Kaiser, both of them part of the larger consciousness that the archive had tried to explain, the awareness that encompasses all individual perspectives while transcending any single viewpoint. They're not gone, not exactly, any more than the archive's creators are gone despite abandoning physical form millions of years ago. They're transformed, dispersed, integrated into larger patterns, and perhaps occasionally, when conditions are exactly right, some fragment of what they were influences what's currently emerging, guides current consciousness toward insights they achieved, nudges reality in directions that honor the work they did while alive. We can't prove this, can't verify it scientifically, but the archive suggested it was true, that consciousness was conserved in ways humans didn't yet understand, that death was transformation rather than ending. So Thomas and Kaiser continue their service in whatever form that service now takes, and the mountains stand guardian over secrets they helped preserve, and humanity stumbles forward, carrying gifts they don't recognize as gifts, guided by wisdom they don't acknowledge as guidance, moving incrementally toward futures that might be worthy of the knowledge waiting for them in frozen caves and ancient archives and strange books that blur the boundary between fiction and truth. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can hope to achieve, to serve faithfully within our limitations, to learn what we can and share what we should, to be curious enough to investigate and wise enough to protect, to trust that our small contributions matter even when we can't see their ultimate consequences. Thomas didn't save the world, didn't revolutionize human understanding, didn't become famous or influential in any conventional sense, but he mattered. His choices mattered. His willingness to descend into mystery mattered. And because he existed, because he followed his dog on a frozen morning into an impossible cave, reality is slightly different than it would have been without him. That's the real story, the one beneath the surface of adventure and wonder and impossible physics. That individuals matter, that choices matter, that being willing to question what seems solid and investigate what seems impossible can lead to discoveries that change everything, even if those changes are too subtle for most people to notice. Thomas learned this in the archive, integrated it into his understanding of existence, and lived according to it during his remaining years. And perhaps that's the most important knowledge he transmitted, more valuable than any technical principle or mathematical framework. We are not helpless, the archive had conveyed. We are not insignificant. Each consciousness that ever exists contributes unique perspective to the universe's self-understanding, and the loss of any perspective is genuine loss, diminishment of reality's richness. So how we live matters, how we treat mysteries matters, whether we respond to wonders with weaponization or wisdom matters profoundly, shapes possibilities for all consciousness that follows us. Thomas chose wisdom, chose protection over exploitation, chose to be guardian rather than exploiter, and perhaps somewhere in some distant future, when humanity has matured sufficiently to safely access the knowledge waiting in archives scattered throughout their world, they'll look back and recognize that individuals like Thomas, ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, were essential to their survival, were bridges that allowed knowledge to cross from one era to another without triggering catastrophe along the way. But we won't know, can't know, whether that future arrives or whether humanity destroys itself before achieving sufficient wisdom. Whether the seeds Thomas planted flourish or die, whether his book influences anyone who makes a difference or simply entertains readers who never grasp its deeper significance. That uncertainty is part of the wisdom the archive taught, the recognition that we can't control outcomes, can't guarantee results, can only do our best and trust that our efforts contribute to something larger than our understanding can encompass. So the story ends here, with a man and a dog who ventured into frozen darkness and returned bearing light, with knowledge preserved and transmitted and protected, with mysteries remaining mysterious but slightly less dangerous because someone cared enough to approach them with respect rather than rapacity. The cave is sealed, the archive sleeps, the mountain stands indifferent, and life continues in its ordinary patterns, slightly touched by extraordinary events that most people will never know occurred. And perhaps that's how it should be. Wisdom preserved in silence, knowledge hidden in plain sight, truth encoded in stories that seem like fiction, waiting for those rare individuals who combine curiosity with caution, courage with wisdom, openness with discrimination, ready to descend when their dogs start barking at something invisible, ready to follow into frozen caves, ready to learn what the universe is trying to teach.